Okay, in the final segment for chapter 30, we're going to discuss the angiosperms, which is the second major group of. Now, angiosperms have special reproductive adaptations, and these include the flowers and fruits. So, angiosperms began to replace the gymnosperms at about the end of the Mesozoic. Angiosperms are actually seed plants, of course, with flowers and fruits. The seeds are found in the fruits, which are the mature ovaries. So if you're eating fruits and seeds, you're eating ovaries and an embryo. The angiosperms have been found also to be the most widespread and the most diverse of all plants. And again, here is the relationship between gymnosperms and angiosperms. Now, there was a divergence at some point between a common ancestor of the gymnosperm. Okay, so let's talk about the characteristics of angiosperms a little bit more in detail. All angiosperms are classified into one phylum. It's called the Anthophyta. So you could kind of replace the term angiosperms with Anthophyta. Again, they have two key adaptations, which include the flowers and the fruits. The flowers are actually specialized for sexual reproduction, and the fruits are meant to help disperse the plants. So they are actually formed when the ovary wall thickens and it begins to mature. The fruits are going to attract dispersal mechanisms like animals, right? So animals are going to eat the fruits, and they generally eat the seeds inside the fruits. Now, let's talk about the flowers a little bit more in detail. The flowers have a number of specialized structures, and again, remember the flowers are meant for reproduction. The flower is actually a specialized shoot with up to 4 types of modified leaves, and these are called floral organs. These 4 types of modified leaves might include the petal, the stamen and carpel, and the sepals. And we're going to talk about each one of these structures. So the stamens are going to be these structures that produce the pollen. So they're blue and they are considered the male component of a flower. The carpels are going to produce the ovules. So the ovules are going to be inside the ovary, okay, and then part of the ovary kind of extends out into the open, and this is called the carpel. So, well, the carpel kind of includes everything almost. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that when we get to more detail there. The petals are generally brightly colored in order to attract pollinators like insects and maybe animals, other animals. So the sepals were they were leaves that enclosed the bud before the flower developed. And the receptacle is going to be where the floral parts or organs are going to kind of connect with the stem. All right, so the stamen includes the filament and the anther. The filament is a long stalk, and at the tip of it is a sac, which is the anther. So the anther is the sac that's at the very tip, and it's at the anther where the pollen is produced. The carpel consists of pretty much all of this. It consists of the stigma, the style, the ovary, and then within the ovary are the ovules. Now, the ovary contains the ovules, so all the ovules are going to be lined up inside the ovary. And then there's a long extension called the style that allows the stigma to stick out beyond the flower parts. And this is kind of important because it helps with pollination. So the stigma generally it has a like sticky substance at the very top to allow the pollen to stick to it so that once the pollen lands on it, it stays, and then it's going to eventually, similar to the pine life cycle, develop a pollen tube, which will lead to the ovary. Now, flowers that have all 4 organs, okay, so I'm talking about the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and the carpels, are going to be called complete flowers. those flowers that lack one or more of those four organs are called incomplete flowers. Now, flowers can vary in size, shape, color, and odor. So some of them attract pollinators by their odors. Now, in terms of symmetry, that would be more like their shape. So some flowers are radial in symmetry, and some of them are bilateral in symmetry. So bilateral symmetry, there's only one plane in which you can divide it where there will be equal sides. For radial, you can kind of divide it in a number of different ways and still come out with symmetrical sides. Now, bilateral symmetry has some significance in terms of the evolution of plants and animals. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Fruits protect the seeds and aid in their dispersal. So, fruits can be either fleshy or dry. So, you're probably familiar with a lot of the fleshy fruits. Also, probably some of the dry fruits. Some dry fruits might include the milkweed fruit with the seed attached to it, as well as the hazelnut, right, which has a very strong shell over it. Now, various fruit adaptations allowed special dispersal of the seeds. So, seeds can be carried by wind, water, or animals. So, these are some examples of mechanisms. So, some of them can open up, like the fruit could open up and disperse the seeds in more of an explosive action. So, it pops open and shoots them out so that they disperse that way. They could be dispersed by having wings, so that would be more by wind, and then by animals in a couple different ways. So, of course, there are some brightly colored fruits with seeds inside them, which kind of attract um, animals to eat them. And then, of course, the animal is going to roam and eventually defecate, and the seeds go out with the feces of the animal. They could also attach by little hooks or barbs within the fruit or the seed and disperse in that way. Again, animals can roam very long distances, so it allows for seed dispersal much longer than perhaps wind or just a simple explosive action. Now, in terms of the angiosperm life cycle, there are some similarities and some differences from gymnosperms. The similarities to gymnosperms are that they are heterosporous and they produce an ovule, and a pollen is associated with the process. Now, there are some key differences. What happens in angiosperms is double fertilization, and an endosperm, which is triploid, that means it has three copies of each of the chromosomes, it develops during this process. Let's look at the cycle. So, some of the things are not present here to make it a little bit simpler. So we're going to talk about double fertilization when it comes to it. So let's go ahead and start here with the carpel and the anther. So remember, the anther is going to produce the pollen. Okay, so at the very tip we have the microsporocytes. Remember, micro and mega. So we have microsporocytes, which are going to undergo meiosis to produce microspores. And then they're going to be, basically, this is a mature pollen right here. So inside the mature pollen, you have the generative cell, the tube cell, and the tube nucleus. Now, a lot of these have some significance, so we'll talk about that when we get through pollen. So remember, the pollen is going to land on the stigma, which is the female part. So I'm going to kind of pop in the female parts, and it's going to land on the stigma and then generate a pollen tube and then lead to the ovary and to an ovule. Now, what happens in the ovule is over here. So we have the ovary here, we have the ovule. Inside the ovule, we have the megasporangium and the megasporocytes, which are going to undergo meiosis. Remember, after meiosis, there are four cells. Only one cell is going to survive, and that'll be the megaspore, which will contain the egg cell nucleus. And surrounding that would be, of course, the megasporangium still. So again, remember the micropyle and the teguments. For angiosperms, you can see there are two integuments as opposed to only one integument in the gymnosperms. So, going a little bit further, let's go ahead and show pollination. So we have the pollen landing on here, generating a pollen tube, and then inside the ovule, we also have we have the egg cell nucleus, and then there are two cells associated with the egg, which are the synergids. And then we have two polar central nuclei, and then antipodal cells. Now, um, the function of some of these is not very clear, so there is some question as to the function of the antipodal cells. Now, the synergids generally lie across or on either side of the egg, and they seem to help the pollen nucleus reach the egg. So they kind of help maybe direct the pollen nucleus to reach the egg for fertilization. Now, the polar central nuclei are eventually going to be fertilized with each other and another sperm nucleus to create the endosperm. So that's how you get this triploid or 3N type of structure. So what happens here is two sperm nuclei are going to be discharged. Okay, one of them is going to fertilize the egg, and the other one is going to fuse with the central nuclei to create the endosperm. So now we have the fertilized egg, which is the zygote, and we have the endosperm, which is going to start to develop. So as it matures, so now we're developing a seed here. As the seed matures, the seed coat is going to develop a lot stronger from the integument. And then we have a growing embryo, and the endosperm serves as a food source for the growing embryo. Now, again, the seed may be dispersed, and if it happens to land somewhere which is fertile, it can germinate and then develop into a seedling. Now, these seedlings can have one or two leaves or embryonic leaves, and this would make the difference between the monocot and the eudicot. And we're going to discuss that later. All right, so in terms of the angiosperm evolution, Darwin actually called these an abominable mystery because of their sudden widespread appearance. And still, this mystery hasn't been resolved. However, we do see some, I guess, fossils or ancestors of the angiosperms, kind of indicating the evolution of them. So we have one example here, which is herbaceous, and it's thought that it is aquatic. Okay, so that's this one right here, Archaeopteryx sinaceus. And then we have this is it, growing, whatever. You could see the carpel, and it's got stamen, right? And then these, again, it's thought to be aquatic, so these the branching leaf-like structures are thought to be like have a function in floating. So, in terms of the phylogeny, the ancestors of angiosperms and gymnosperms are thought to have diverged about 305 million years ago. So, around 300 million years ago, there was a divergence. Now, angiosperms may be closely related to these Benedictalis. These are kind of like in between the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. They do have seeds with flower-like structures. They're not actually flowers, right? But they're flower-like structures. So these are almost like the missing link. Now, let's look at the phylogeny. We have the Ambarella, the water lilies, and the Staronies. These are considered the basal angiosperms. Now, showing them in relation to the gymnosperms, it looks like the Benedictalis falls somewhere in between there. So they're like the link between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So here we have the living gymnosperms. We have the Benedictalis. Again, it's a dotted line, so we're not quite sure exactly where that lies in terms of the phylogeny. However, this is where it's suspected to be. Now we have the three basal groups, and then we have the magnolids, which is a relatively old group of angiosperms, and then we have the monocots and the eudicots. Right, so in terms of evolutionary links with animals, so remember I told you that the bilateral symmetry has some significance with the evolution of the angiosperms as well as the animals that pollinate them. So it's thought that, there's evidence that animals influence the evolution of plants, and plants influence the evolution of animals. So they both influence the evolution of each other. So animal herbivory, so that means animals that eat plants, right? It selects for plant defenses. So what this does is select for defenses against animal herbivory. So it's going to select for certain, let's say, the production of certain chemicals, which may inhibit animals from eating them. Also, the interactions between the pollinators and the flowering plants select for beneficial adaptations in plants and animals. So, bilateral flowers tend to restrict the movement of pollinators, so they can only kind of fit in there in a certain way. And then pollen would be applied to the animal parts, which would contact the stigma of the same species. So it allows pollination between the same species rather than different species, which would generate a hybrid. And again, remember, hybrids are generally less fit, so that's not beneficial. Um, there's a experiment shown in your book, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So this is actually more specific in terms of pollen transfer. So this specificity is thought to reduce gene flow between diverging populations, and it could increase rates of speciation in these types of plants. So this can be tested. Okay, so by comparing the number of species in closely related bilateral and radial clades. Okay, so here we have the common ancestor of bilateral plant species and radial plant species. So you would expect that um, if you should see an increased rate of speciation in those plants in which the gene flow has been reduced due to specificity of the pollen transfer. So you would expect that there would be more species in the bilateral clade than the radial clade, and that is in fact true. There are significantly more species in the bilateral clade. So this is the evidence that suggests that this actually occurs. All right, let's move into angiosperm diversity. So we know now that there are about 250,000 living species of angiosperms. Now, of course, more, it could be more or less. Previously, the angiosperms were divided up into two main groups, just the monocots and the dicots. And monocots means one cotyledon, and then the dicots means two cotyledons. And remember when I was talking about the seedling being developed into an embryonic leaf? Well, the embryonic leaf is the cotyledon, so there could be one cotyledon or two cotyledons. And the monocots are the dicots. Now, there's the clade eudicot, which are actually the true dicots, which includes most dicots. Okay, so for purposes of this course, we're just going to kind of use dicot and eudicot interchangeably. So whenever dicot is mentioned, assume it's eudicot. Whenever eudicot is mentioned, assume it's dicot. So they can be used. Now let's look at the differences between the monocots and the eudicots. Okay, so in terms of their embryonic leaves, right? So during development or germination of the seeds, the monocots produce one embryonic leaf, or one cotyledon, and the eudicots produce two. The monocots, in terms of their leaves, the veins in their leaves are generally parallel along the length of the leaf. The eudicots generally have a net-like or branched-like pattern of their leaves, or the veins in their leaves. In terms of the stems, if you took a cross-section of a stem and looked at the vascular tissue, or the distribution of the vascular tissue, in monocots, the vascular tissue would be relatively evenly distributed throughout the stem. So it just scattered all around, no really defined shape. In the eudicots, there's like a ring, right? The vascular tissue is arranged in a ring around the outer edge of the stem. For the roots, the monocots generally have fibrous roots with no main taproot. The eudicots have this main taproot with which the branched fibers are going to kind of spread out from there. In terms of the pollen, the monocots have one opening within their pollen, And the eudicots generally have three openings. And the openings may be seen as perhaps grooves in the pollen. And in terms of the flowers, you can count the petals, so you can count the flower organs. If they are in multiples of three, it's a monocot. If it's multiples of four or five, it's a eudicot. So you could just look at some of the macro structures, basically the leaves, the things you can see with your eye, without needing a microscope to determine whether it's a monocot or a eudicot. All right, so the rest of the former dicots form several lineages, and this includes the basal angiosperms. So again, always the basal angiosperms are the oldest lineages. The magnolids share some of the traits with the basal angiosperms, but evolved later. So these really include the former dicots, but then we have the eudicots. Let's just go ahead and put the dicots in the eudicots and separate them from the monocots. So the basal angiosperms include three major groups. The very oldest would be the Amberella. And remember, the organism before that would be that Benedictalis, which is kind of the link between gymnosperms and angiosperms. So this consists of about 100 species of all of these groups right here, and these are some examples right here. Very beautiful. Now, the magnolids include the magnolia, but there are probably over 8,000 species. And some of these have woody type structures, woody stems, and some of them are herbaceous. Now, these are more closely related to the monocots and the eudicots than they are the basal angiosperms, which is quite interesting. So you would kind of, that's why I like to kind of combine the monocots or the dicots with the eudicots, because this would kind of put the magnolids in that particular category as well. Now the monocots, basically only about 25% of angiosperms are a monocot, so that makes up about 70,000 species. The largest group of the monocots include the orchids, the grassids, and the palms. So these are relatively common. Then the eudicots are pretty much most of the rest of them, except for the basal angiosperms. So that's about 2/3 of the angiosperms. So that's probably about 66% and makes up about 170 species. These include the legumes, which produce the seeds or beans and nuts, and the important the rose families. This is a good table showing the derived traits of seed plants. So this is a really good review. So if we remember, seed plants have reduced gametophytes, sometimes microscopic. They are all heterosporous. Remember, they produce two types of spores, the megaspore and the microspore. The megaspore gives rise to the female gametophyte. The microspore gives rise to the male gametophyte. The ovules are produced. This shows an ovule of a gymnosperm, and again, this is where the megaspore and the egg is going to be present inside. And then the pollen is the male, which is going to have the male sperm in it. And again, the pollen allows for these plants to thrive in dry climates because they do not need water to disperse. And then, of course, the seed also allows these types of plants to thrive in drier climates because it's protected by a seed coat, and it allows for much further dispersal. In summary, the angiosperms have a link, their evolution has a link to animals' evolution, so they're kind of co-evolved together. And we talked about the angiosperm traits, the basal angiosperms and the other taxa, including the monocots and the eudicots and their differences, and the structures of the flowers and the functions of each structure, as well as fruits and different types of dispersal of the fruits. And this kind of concludes chapter 30.